Just after midnight on a cold January night in 2010, a 911 call crackled through the Colton Police dispatcher's radio. The voice on the line sounded urgent but oddly calm. A woman saying a child had stopped breathing. When paramedics arrived at the single story home on Latham Street, the air inside was thick with the sour smell of sickness and prayer. Gospel music still played softly from a stereo in the corner. On the living room floor lay a boy, barely 4 years old, his skin ashen and still. The adults gathered around him. 5 of them did not look like panicked parents. They looked like congregants. They were murmuring in rhythm, eyes closed, hands hovering over the boy's body as if willing his small chest to rise again. In the next room, someone was speaking in tongues. But by dawn, the boy, Timothy Thomas, was dead. Police would later learn that this house belonged to a little known religious fellowship called His Way Spirit Led Assemblies, a group that preached divine healing, obedience, and the coming end of the world. Its leaders claimed to speak for God. Its followers believed them. And within the walls of their rented homes across California's inland empire, loyalty was demanded, questions were punished, and children were not always safe. At the time, Timothy's death barely made the news. Officials called it, quote, natural causes. But the truth, buried under a decade of silence and fear, would not stay hidden forever, because Timothy's story was not an ending. It was the first crack in the wall of a group that would later be tied to disappearances, secrets, and a trail of devotion turned deadly. Today, we are telling Timothy's story. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. If you like this sort of thing, I post deep dive videos every single week, sometimes up to 3, so please consider subscribing if you are into this sort of thing. I would absolutely love to have you here. Also, yes, I am a millennial, in case you couldn't tell from the millennial side. Wait, which side is it? The millennial side part I'm rocking today. I'm like, man, I feel like I'm looking extra millennial today. Anyways, let's jump into it. In the early 2000s, amid the arid subdivisions and strip malls of California's inland empire, a small religious congregation quietly took root. It called itself His Way Spirit Led Assemblies, an innocuous name beliing the intense world that would develop behind closed doors. The group's founders, a husband and wife duo named Daryl Music Martin and Shelley Catherine Bailey Martin, presented themselves not just as pastors, but as divine messengers. Daryl assumed the role of a charismatic leader, while Catherine, known to followers as Cat, claimed to be a prophetess, even a gifted oracle, channeling the voice of God. Together, they gathered a handful of devoted followers into a tight knit flock. In those early days, nothing about His Way Spirit led assemblies made headlines. To neighbors and outsiders, the group was virtually invisible, just another home based prayer circle or small church meeting in living room. Yet, from the beginning, the Martins' ministry operated more like an insular sect than a typical community church. The congregation never grew large, maybe a few dozen members at most, but it was intensely devoted. Members often lived together in communal arrangements, occupying ordinary houses in working class Inland Empire neighborhoods. Over time, the group shifted from one rental home to another, a suburban house in Colton for a while, later a place in Claremont, and eventually a compound in rural Hemet. These moves kept the group under the radar and away from too many prying eyes. Inside their shared homes, life was strictly controlled. Former adherents would later describe how even the rooms in one house were numbered, with one room set aside solely for prayer. The Martins fostered an environment of constant worship, obedience, and communal labor. They did not advertise Sunday services or put up a sign out front. His way spirit led assemblies existed largely off the map, known only to its members and those they carefully chose to interact with. To outsiders, his way spirit led assemblies looked like a handful of families sharing faith and rent. To those inside, it was a world apart, sealed off by ritual, fear, and the conviction that salvation depended on obedience. Everyday life revolved around the Martins. Daryl was pastor, Catherine was prophet. Their words carried divine weight. Every morning began with a house wide prayer session, often stretching on for hours. No one was allowed to leave for work or errands before the Spirit had spoken. When Catherine entered what she called the presence, a kind of trance in which she claimed to channel God, members would drop to their knees, weeping, murmuring, or scribbling her words into notebooks. Her prophecies governed everything: where someone should live, whom they could marry, when to fast, and even which color of clothing to wear that week. The Martins called this total submission walking in his way. In practice, it meant surrendering one's agency. Members were told that independent thought was the whisper of Satan, doubt was rebellion, and to question a prophecy was to question God himself. Those who hesitated were accused of harboring a spirit of resistance, and public confession would be expected. After dawn prayers came work hours, usually spent running the group's pest control company, Full Shield, cleaning the communal house, or doing odd jobs for cash that would go into the Kingdom Fund. Paychecks were all turned over to the Martins, who decided what each person needed, whether it was food, clothing, transportation. They were all shared resources. And members ate very simple meals: rice, beans, and lentils, and were told that worldly cravings were just a test of faith. Evenings would bring a marathon worship session. These could stretch until 2 or 3 in the morning, fueled by ecstatic music and shouted prayers. Sleep, of course, was fragmented. Exhaustion kept people pliable. A former resident recalled that the windows were always covered, the lights were always dim, and the atmosphere was both electric but claustrophobic. Quote, "You didn't know if it was Tuesday or Sunday," she said. "You just prayed until Cat said you could stop," unquote. And contact with outsiders was discouraged unless it served the ministry. Members were told the world was corrupt, Babylon soon to burn in the coming apocalypse. Family members who questioned the group's teachings were labeled tools of the enemy. Phone calls were all monitored and visits were discouraged. Those who tried to leave were warned that disaster would strike them, whether it was car crashes, cancer, or even demonic attack. Children would grow up inside this insular bubble. They were homeschooled, taught that public education was brainwashing, and also the discipline was strict. If you disobeyed, you would have to fast. You would need public prayer for forgiveness, and sometimes even corporal punishment. Parents surrendered authority to the Martins. Even those small choices, like what toys a child could have, what books they could read, all required approval. But the most powerful form of control wasn't physical, but emotional. The Martins alternated between warmth and humiliation, a rhythm psychologists call coercive bonding. During worship, Daryl would praise members for their devotion, and hours later, he might berate them for spiritual laziness. Catherine's prophecies often singled people out. Quote, "The Spirit says you have failed your calling," she'd announce, and the accused would end up collapsing into tears. Public repentance bound members together through shared guilt and fear. Over time, people lost the sense of where their own thoughts ended and the group's doctrine began. Sleep deprivation, constant prayer, and a closed social circle created a self reinforcing loop. If someone got sick, it was a test of faith. If their prayers failed, it was because they lacked purity. When the outside world doubted them, it proved the prophecy that persecution would come. And money was another lever. Every dollar was God's property. Members' bank accounts were pooled, and Daryl managed the ledgers. He handled rent, food, car payments, and then presented it all as benevolent care. In truth, it ensured that no one could leave without facing complete financial ruin. This pest controlled business that I mentioned earlier functioned as both an income stream and an alibi. To clients, Full Shield looked legitimate, but to the group, it was sacred labor. Work was worship, and exhaustion was devotion. Another thing that reinforced identity within the group was ritual. There would be fasting cycles, prophecy circles, and deliverance nights that created alternating states of deprivation and euphoria. Members would testify about demons being cast out, about visions of fire sweeping the earth. Catherine's trances, with her eyes closed, voice low and rhythmic, were all treated as miracles. And Daryl often interpreted her words, giving them practical orders. Sell your car, quit your job, move into the next house. And when someone obeyed, the group celebrated. But when they hesitated, they were broken in prayer until they complied. By the late 2000s, the Martins preached that the end times were imminent. They stockpiled canned food, water barrels, and medical kits. They kept generators and began collecting firearms, ostensibly for protection, though the threat was never clearly defined. Outsiders were seen as potential attackers, law enforcement as instruments of the Antichrist. And in this atmosphere, even a child's illness could be interpreted as a spiritual battle rather than a medical emergency. And that brings us back to poor young Timothy Thomas. Within that worldview, his sickness became something else. It was a test of faith, not a warning sign. The adults who surrounded him that night weren't indifferent. They were entranced, convinced they were fighting for his soul rather than his body. Those who joined the Assemblies found themselves under the total authority of the Martins. From the earliest days of his way Spirit-led assembly, the Martins preached that medicine was a temptation, a test designed to separate the truly faithful from those still bound to the world. They quoted verses about healing through prayer and rebuked all weakness in the name of Jesus, twisting familiar Pentecostal language into a system of control. To Kat, doctors represented not healing but interference. In sermons delivered inside living rooms and makeshift sanctuaries, she warned that hospitals were, quote, dens of fear, and physicians were agents of doubt. Illness, she said, was the language of God, his way of exposing sin or weakness. To seek medical help was to interpret that divine process. For followers, this belief sank deep. It began subtly. A headache treated with a prayer, a cough dismissed as spiritual warfare. But over time, medical avoidance became a badge of holiness. Members were told to testify when they resisted seeing a doctor as proof that their faith was stronger than pain. Inside the group's communal houses, the medicine cabinet was nearly bare. A few bandages, some herbal tinctures, and oil for anointing, but nothing more. Serious ailments were handled with fasting. Hands were laid on the sick, and there would be hours of, quote, deliverance prayer. Unquote. The Martins called these sessions battles in the spirit. The sick person would be surrounded by others, with music playing, voices rising until exhaustion blurred the line between faith and frenzy. If the fever broke, it was a miracle. If it didn't, the sufferer was told they hadn't yet repented enough. So I think there could be an argument that Timothy's death was due to negligence. Perhaps not a direct malicious murder, but definitely death due to neglect and negligence. This group used medical control as a spiritual power. This doctrine did more than express faith, it concentrated power into the Martins' hands. By controlling access to healthcare, they controlled life and death decisions. When a member fell ill, the first question wasn't what's wrong, but what does Kat say? The answer would come in a form of a revelation. Kat would close her eyes and begin to speak in rhythmic, breathy tones and announce what God had shown her. The Spirit says this is an attack of unbelief, or the Lord says you're being purified. Absolutely disgusting. Her husband Daryl would then translate prophecy into action. He would forbid hospital visits outright or insist that they needed a night of prayer covering first. For followers raised to see Daryl and Kat as conduits of God, defiance was just unthinkable. They would almost rather die. In one former member's words, quote, "You stopped trusting your body. You stopped trusting your own eyes. If Kat said you were healed, even if you were still sick," unquote. That submission created a cycle of dependency. Members who suffered through illness and then recovered naturally saw it as confirmation of Kat's power. Each survival story strengthened the myth, but each death or worsening condition was explained away as a lack of faith. The logic was airtight in their eyes, but it was also deadly. Now, faith healing isn't uncommon in American Pentecostalism, but what the Martins built went far beyond mainstream charismatic belief. In their theology, medicine wasn't just unnecessary, it was sinful. It was a symbol of moral decay. Hospitals were Babylon, antibiotics were false idols. Yeah. The group's sermons were often borrowed from a strain of end times rhetoric popular in certain fringe ministries, that the medical system was part of a coming Antichrist order. Vaccines, mental health drugs, and even prenatal care were painted as tools of population control. The only true healer was God, accessed through obedience to his prophets, meaning to the Martins. This ideology bred self policing. Members watched one another for signs of doubt. Someone caught taking aspirin might be called before the group to confess a lapse in faith. Catherine would then lecture them on trusting man's wisdom and demand a public vow never to do it again. Shame became as potent as the doctrine itself. Now, this belief system directly shaped Timothy Thomas's final days. His appendix ruptured slowly, a process that, with medical care, is almost always survivable. But in that house on Latham Street, sickness was not treated as biology. It was treated as defiance of prophecy. When Timothy vomited from pain, Daryl allegedly told him to hold it in, to resist weakness. And the boy, raised to obey, tried. By the time his caretakers realized something was really wrong, the infection had spread beyond recovery. For years afterward, the Martins framed his death as a spiritual event, God calling him home. Inside the group, no one spoke of appendicitis. They spoke of warfare, testing, and victory through faith. The adults who had prayed over Timothy that night believed, heartbreaking sincerity, that they were saving him. Even after Timothy's death drew police scrutiny, the Martins didn't soften their stance. Former members recalled being told that the investigation was persecution, which was just more proof that the outside world hated God's true church. When reporters asked why no doctor had been called, Daryl replied that the Spirit had been guiding them all along. In the years that followed, the same distrust endured. The group refused vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic. Members avoided hospitals except under extreme duress. And Catherine continued preaching that true healing comes only through surrender. When two adult men, Reuben Moreno and later Amelio, vanished years later, investigators noted a chilling continuity. The same pattern of isolation, secrecy, and rejection of outside help. It wasn't that the Martins sought death, it's that they refused the world's version of life. The rejection of medicine in his way Spirit-led assemblies wasn't merely theological, it was strategic. It kept members inward facing. When people stopped trusting doctors, they stopped trusting the systems like hospitals, schools, courts, and even the police. Every pillar of secular life becomes suspect, and the only refuge left is the group itself. That firewall of distrust allowed the Martins to rule unchallenged for decades. It ensured that when tragedy struck, like Timothy's death, outsiders learned about it too late to intervene. By early 2010, the doctrine of divine healing had hardened into law. The Martins no longer needed to forbid hospitals outright. Their followers wouldn't have gone even if allowed. To seek help beyond the circle was to betray God himself. So when a little boy named Timothy Thomas fell ill one winter night, no one thought to call a doctor. They did what they'd been taught to do. They prayed, they fasted, and they waited for a miracle that never came. On January 16th, 2010, a 911 call brought paramedics and police racing to a modest house at 1521 Latham Street in Colton, one of the homes used by His Way Spirit-led Assemblies. Inside, responders found a dire scene. 4-year-old Timothy Thomas lay unresponsive, limp, and pale, with vomit around his mouth. Members of the household, the adult followers, stood by anxiously as the medics tried to resuscitate the boy. He was rushed to the nearest hospital, but tragically, little Timothy was pronounced dead within an hour. And to think that these people blamed a 4-year-old's lack of faith on his death. That's a child. He's barely lived in the world. Disgusting to think about. The initial cause of death, determined soon after by the coroner, was septic shock from a ruptured appendix. In medical terms, his appendix had burst due to untreated appendicitis, leading to a fatal infection. On the surface, that might have appeared to be a natural, if sadly unmanaged, medical emergency. But as Colton police officers began looking into the circumstances, troubling questions arose. Why hadn't this child received prompt medical care for what should have been a straightforward illness? And what exactly was going on in that house? Police learned that Timothy and 2 of his siblings had been in the temporary custody of Daryl and Catherine Martin at the time. Timothy's parents, who lived locally, had apparently given over the care of their 3 young children to the Martins group. Perhaps because they were going through hard times and the Martins offered help, we're not really sure. It was a decision that would haunt the family for the rest of their lives. Investigators interviewing relatives heard that once the children were under the Martins' roof, their biological mother was not allowed to visit them freely. One aunt told police that the Martins had actively kept the mother away, supposedly for the child's well-being, though it struck the family as highly suspicious and controlling. And as detectives dug deeper into Timothy's final days, more red flags emerged. One of Timothy's aunts came forward with a horrifying allegation. She believed Daryl Martin was directly responsible for Timothy's death. This aunt recounted to the Colton police and later to child welfare authorities that she had observed disturbing behavior. According to her, when Timothy had been feeling ill, Daryl Martin instructed the boy not to vomit. In fact, Daryl allegedly demonstrated to Timothy how to clamp his hand over his own mouth to physically hold back any vomit. It's hard to fathom the reasoning. Perhaps Daryl thought the boy would simply will away his sickness, or he wanted to avoid a mess, which is horrendous to think about. But the outcome was deadly. Vomiting is a natural reflex to serious illnesses like appendicitis. Preventing vomiting could trap those toxins inside the body. And that detail, combined with the fact that no one in the house sought timely medical help for the child, painted a picture of severe neglect at its best. And Colton police suspected as much. Detective Jack Morenberg, who handled the initial investigation, noted in his report that the household had the appearance of a possible cult-like ministry. Officers encountered an almost bunker-like mentality among the adults in the house. They gave inconsistent stories about what had happened to Timothy and when his symptoms had started. Some seemed evasive or downright uncooperative with basic questions. This obfuscation made it difficult to pin down the exact timeline of Timothy's illness and his caretaker's inaction. Nevertheless, by later in 2010, Colton Police Sergeant Sean McFarland and his colleagues felt they had enough evidence to pursue charges. They believed Timothy Thomas had died due to child neglect at the hands of his caretakers, the Martins. The case was presented to the San Bernardino County District Attorney's Office, and detectives recommended that Daryl and Catherine be charged in connection with the boy's death. Prosecutors, however, declined to file charges. Without a clear admission or a consistent narrative from witnesses, they felt they could not convince a jury that the caretaker's negligence rose to the level of criminal culpability. Re-effindiculous. The official cause of death remained a natural medical event, and despite the troubling circumstances, no one was held legally responsible. It was a devastating outcome for Timothy's family. His relatives, especially the aunts who had tried to intervene, were furious and heartbroken. One of those aunts even reached out to Child Protective Services the moment Timothy died, imploring authorities to remove the other two Thomas children from the home. And CPS did step in, and the surviving siblings were indeed taken out of the group's custody as a precaution. For the Martins and their followers, the end of the investigation without charges was a relief, and perhaps, in their eyes, a vindication. But the stigma of Timothy's death lingered. Inside the group, it became an event shrouded in secrecy and defensiveness. According to later statements, some members had been pressured by the Martins to lie to the police in 2010. They did as they were told out of fear or misguided loyalty, and then they tried to put the episode behind them. But meanwhile, the Colton house eventually disbanded. By 2011, the group quietly relocated as if trying to escape the shadow of what had happened. For the broader community, Timothy Thomas's death was a blip on the news, a tragic story with no clear resolution. Most people in the Inland Empire had never heard of his Way Spirit-led assemblies in the first place, and after 2010, they had even less reason to. The group retreated further into obscurity. After 2010, Daryl and Catherine Martin kept a low profile. They moved their base of operations and continued their ministry in relative secrecy. By the mid-2010s, members of his Way Spirit-led assemblies were living in other Inland Empire locales, notably a home in the city of Claremont, in a quiet neighborhood on Swarthmore Court, and later a rural property out in Hemet. They no longer clustered in Colton, where Timothy had died, perhaps to avoid curious neighbors or lingering suspicion. And in their new locations, the group maintained the same insular habits. Neighbors in Claremont and Hemet occasionally noticed odd patterns, like lights on and singing late at night, the adults in the household rarely engaging in casual chat. The children, if there were still any in the group, weren't seen playing outside or going to school. But these peculiarities never escalated to anything that drew police attention. That is, until 2019, nearly a decade later, that the group again came into law enforcement's radar. In August of that year, the Claremont Police Department received a missing person report that would spark new questions about his Way Spirit-led assemblies. The family of a middle-aged man named Reuben Moreno contacted Claremont authorities to say that Reuben had disappeared, and he'd last been seen while living with the Martins religious group. Reuben Moreno, who was 43 years old in 2019, had been a devoted member of the Assemblies for many years. He was, in fact, one of those who had lived in the Colton houses during the 2000s and later at the Swarthmore Courthouse in Claremont. For Reuben's relatives to file a missing person report in 2019, however, meant that they hadn't seen or heard from him in a long time. As Claremont police investigated, they discovered that Reuben hadn't actually been seen since late 2017. Then, he vanished. Strangely, none of Reuben's housemates or fellow congregates ever reported him missing. It seems they told anyone who asked, such as Reuben's extended family, that Reuben had left the group on his own accord in around 2017. Perhaps they implied that he didn't want contact, or maybe Reuben's family was so out of touch thanks to the group's isolation that it took 2 years for them to realize something was very wrong. The Claremont Police Department opened a case on Reuben Moreno, but with a 2-year gap between when he was last seen and when it was reported, leads were cold. Claremont detectives questioned the Martins and some group members in 2019 but got nothing useful. The group claimed that Reuben had just walked away one day. With no evidence of foul play, no crime scene, no physical evidence, there was little more the police could do immediately. They entered Reuben's name into missing persons databases and just kind of hoped for the best. For the next few years, Reuben's fate remained a mystery, his case file gathering dust. But soon, it would be dusted off and reopened, because one of the most faithful members of the group through all these years was a man named Amelio Salem Ganem. Amelio had joined the group around 2000 when he was a young man, only 18 years old. Over the 2 decades, he became deeply embedded in the Assembly's life and work. He lived in the group's communal houses. He also helped the group become financially self-sustaining. Alongside the Martins, Amelio had been the one who helped establish Full Shield Inc., that pest control business. He became a licensed exterminator and was essentially the operations manager for Full Shield. Neighbors in Colton and other areas would often see Amelio in his work uniform, driving the truck with the Full Shield logo to service local homes and businesses. And many clients likely assumed that he was just an ordinary pest control guy, never guessing that their mild mannered exterminator was part of a secretive religious sect. Emilio was, by all accounts, loyal and hardworking. For over 20 years, he devoted himself to the Assemblies. But as he entered his 40s, something changed. By early 2023, after more than 2 decades of total commitment, Emilio had made up his mind. He wanted to leave the Assemblies. So he quietly formulated a plan. He would move back to his hometown of Nashville, Tennessee to be closer to his aging parents and siblings, and he would launch his own pest control business there, independent of the group. In April 2023, Emilio informed the group that he was departing. Within weeks of that announcement, on May 8th, 2023, a lawyer representing Full Shield Inc. served Emilio with a cease and desist letter. The letter accused him of something akin to betrayal in business, allegedly stealing clients from Full Shield for his new pest control venture. In other words, the group was claiming that he was poaching their customers as he tried to set up shop independently across the country. These leaders were essentially trying to thwart his livelihood as a means of pressuring him to either stay or at least not compete with them after he left. But he did not return to the fold. He pressed on with his plan to start fresh in Tennessee. And later that month, in May 2023, Amelio would return to Southern California for a short trip. We don't exactly know why. Perhaps he was tying up loose ends, maybe collecting some personal belongings he'd left behind, or saying some quiet goodbyes to a few friends or longtime pest control clients. But on May 25th, 2023, Emilio was seen at a Starbucks coffee shop on Redlands Boulevard in the city of Redlands. He had arranged to meet someone there. The person in question was another member of his Way Spirit-led Assemblies. Reportedly, a high-ranking man in the group whom Emilio believed was also thinking of leaving. Emilio met with this man at the Starbucks, presumably to discuss his plans and perhaps offered to help him transition out. But tragically, that meeting appears to have been a fatal mistake. Emilio was never again seen. And again, this is why it is so difficult for people to leave cults. It's so difficult because you don't have any resources on the outside. And then once you realize that you're in a cult and you want to escape, and someone approaches you saying, I want to escape too, you're inclined to trust them. But Emilio was totally manipulated by this guy. It is so scary what these cult members and leaders are capable of. So when Emilio failed to catch his flight back to Nashville and didn't respond to phone calls, his family immediately grew alarmed because it was completely unlike him. Emilio had been in regular contact ever since he decided to rejoin his family. So on May 30th of that year, his relatives filed a missing person report with the Redlands Police Department. And luckily, the Redlands Police Department took the case very seriously. As Redlands detectives dove into Amelio's disappearance, they quickly learned about the broader context. They found out about Reuben Moreno's unresolved disappearance from a few years prior, and also Timothy Thomas's case from 2010, which were all tied to the same elusive group. This small sect, which had flown under the radar for so long, was now linked to at least 3 major police cases spanning 15 years. 1 dead child and 2 missing men. Investigators from Redlands began coordinating with their counterparts in Claremont for Reuben's case and Colton for Timothy's case. By early 2025, they formed a joint task force of sorts, sharing information and strategy. Sergeant Sean McFarland, the same officer who had pursued charges in Timothy's death a decade before, took a fresh look at the case. He re-interviewed former members of the Assemblies who had been present in 2010. Some of those individuals, no longer under the Martins' sway, finally opened up. They admitted that back in 2010, they had lied or kept quiet under the Martins' duress. Now, with a child's death haunting them and an active investigation giving them another chance, they told the truth. Armed with these new statements and evidence, McFarland prepared to resubmit the case to prosecutors, this time potentially pursuing a charge of child homicide or murder against Daryl and Catherine Martin for Timothy's death. And meanwhile, in Redlands, detectives following Emilio's trial were uncovering crucial evidence. They learned that on the day he vanished after leaving Starbucks, Amelio had driven a white Nissan Frontier pickup, a rental vehicle that he was using, to a location in the nearby city of Grand Terrace. Surveillance cameras captured images of the truck in Grand Terrace later on May 25th, but Amelio wasn't seen with it at that point. But then, the truck disappeared too. Months of diligent police work would pay off when, in mid 2025, Redlands police located the missing Nissan Frontier. The vehicle was completely abandoned, and inside it, they discovered signs of foul play. Unspecified evidence that suggested a violent crime. Redlands police spokesman Carl Baker announced that, based on what they found, they were now treating Emilio's disappearance as likely a homicide. By the summer of 2025, law enforcement had amassed enough suspicion and evidence to take action against the group. Redlands police secured search warrants for multiple locations tied to his way spirit led assemblies. They coordinated closely with the FBI, given the multi jurisdictional nature of the case and the potential that some crimes cross state lines, since Amelia was a Tennessee resident. The targets of these warrants were the group's known strongholds, their Hemet compound, and the rural property in Anza, as well as Daryl and Catherine themselves. In the pre-dawn hours of August 6, 2025, Redlands police, backed by FBI, raided the group's compound in Hemet. After a tense standoff, officers used flashbang grenades and an armored vehicle to storm the fortified property. 4 residents were detained, including Reuben's brother, Rudy Moreno, were arrested when police found several illegal firearms on site. Converted fully automatic rifles, sawed off shotguns, and unserialized ghost guns among them. A week later, on August 12th, authorities served a second search warrant at another property in the rural town of Anza, detaining 8 people and seizing electronic devices and other digital evidence. And around the same time, the Martins themselves were located at a motel in Laguna Hills, Orange County. Daryl, 57, was finally arrested on suspicion of weapons violations, and Kat, 62, was briefly detained because she suffered a medical issue during the arrest and was taken to the hospital. Oh, now she wants to go to the hospital. Hypocrite. Both leaders, along with the other members who had been taken into custody during those raids, were soon released after questioning, and no new charges were immediately filed. But still, the coordinated law enforcement action made one thing clear: the secretive sect was now squarely in the authorities' sights. The raids provided troves of new information. Investigators confiscated computers, cell phones, hard drives, a digital footprint of the group's communications, and perhaps evidence of their plans or involvement in the missing persons cases. They also collected forensic evidence at the properties, looking, no doubt, for any indication that Amelio or Reuben might have been harmed or hidden there. The illegal cache of weapons found at the Hemet house raised its own questions. Why was a self described religious group stockpiling an arsenal of unregistered, high powered guns? To detectives, it hinted that the assemblies might have been arming themselves for an anticipated doomsday or to resist authorities if it ever came down to a confrontation. So, with all of that happening and all of this proof being collected, as of right now, what's going on with the current investigation? Well, frustratingly, as of right now, no one has been charged with a violent crime in these cases. At least not yet. Daryl and Catherine Martin haven't been charged with murder or kidnapping because the investigation is ongoing. The lack of immediate arrests after the raids could indicate that authorities are taking time to build an absolutely airtight case, potentially waiting on lab results, forensic analysis of the digital evidence, or the hope that someone from within the group will finally decide to cooperate in exchange for leniency on lesser charges like those weapons offenses. So, though much is still unknown, piece by piece the truth is emerging. The saga of his way spirit led assemblies is a reminder that even a small, obscure sect can inflict great harm, and that vigilance is essential to protect the innocent and hold such groups to account. 15 years after Timothy Thomas drew his last breath on a living room floor, his name still lingers like a whisper through the Inland Empire's sun-bleached streets. The neighborhoods where his way spirit led assemblies once prayed and preached look ordinary again. Children ride bikes, sprinklers tick-tock across lawns, but the quiet has a different kind of heaviness now. It's the silence that follows a reckoning. In the years since that night, police have come and gone, neighbors have moved, and the group has changed homes and names, but the same shadow trails behind them. Timothy's death, once written off as an accident, now reads like the first chapter of a longer tragedy, one that swallowed others whole. His absence became the echo that investigators would finally start to hear when grown men began vanishing under similar clouds of secrecy. It's absolutely heartbreaking for the friends and the families of Reuben, Amelio, and Timothy that justice has not been served. But hopefully, there is some hope provided for the families that now there is an active investigation looking into this group. This was a really tough one, guys. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I think it's such a fantastic example of really trying to understand why escaping these groups is so difficult. You have people who are conditioned to distrust everyone on the outside, but then when they try to leave, their old friends, people who are still within the cult, end up becoming enemies, could actually end up killing them. We've heard of groups like Scientology totally shunning people who leave or stalking and harassing people who leave. But to kill people who leave is another level. Those are the stakes. It's not just that they don't have financial resources, social resources when they try to leave. There's the threat that they could be killed for simply trying to take a new path in life. So I really hope that this video spoke to you. I know it's a heavy one on a weekend, but I really, really appreciate your time, your attention, and I'm eager to hear what you think about today's video and this group. I will really try to follow this closely and update you as soon as we know new information or even just some more information. Maybe I can go live and talk about it. So, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you have a wonderful and safe rest of your day. Remember to always ask questions and always stay skeptical. I'll see you in my next video soon. Bye.